Good morning and welcome to the Trinity Forum. I'm so excited this morning. We're joined by the Reverend Dr. Lauren Winter, who has just led our Advent retreat, and we're so blessed to have her with us and to be continuing a relationship with her. I'm so thrilled to welcome her. If you don't know her already, either from her books or from her visits to Trinity over the past year, Lauren is a historian, an author, a lecturer, and an Episcopal priest. She is Associate Professor of Christian Spirituality at Duke Divinity School. She writes and lectures on Christian practice, the history of Christianity in America, and on Jewish-Christian relations. She's appeared on PBS's Religion and Ethics News Weekly and has served as a commentator on NPR's All Things Considered. She's written for the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post Book World, Publishers Weekly, Books and Culture, and Christianity Today, and her essays have been included in several volumes of the best Christian writing. And I'm so pleased to have Lauren back with us, not only to be talking, here it is, the beginning of Advent. It's the second Sunday of Advent. We'll be talking a little bit about that and touching on the lives of the saints and how that connects us to Advent. But this is a really great moment to talk with someone with a view to history. I'm thinking about where we are at month 10, 11, or 23 of the pandemic. I'm not sure. I've lost track at this point. I find it so helpful to look at where have the people of the church been in the midst of times of disruption, how things change, but sometimes it's deep change that doesn't come to the surface for months and years and decades. And I think we can look to history, not only to the Christian people throughout history who've certainly seen pandemics before, but to the Episcopal Church and seeing disruption in the midst of our own history here in America. So there I am. I'm talking too much, as usual. Welcome, Lauren. It's so good to have you back.
I'm glad to be here. I wish I were with you in person. The last fun out in the world thing I did before the pandemic was be with you. And it
was fun for us too before we hunkered down.
Yeah, I remember it was the first service that I'd attended where you were navigating how we should pass the peace. So that feels quaint.
I know it does, doesn't it? And I remember thinking at the time, it seems quaint now. Even then, it seemed to me of great significance. Because one of the things that I find really fascinating about the Episcopal Church's history over the last 50 years is what changed in the late 20th century as a church approached 1979 and the new prayer book, and that approach took 50 years. And then we put some things in there that might as well have been there forever for people like me who came to the church in the early 90s. But haven't been there forever. And the peace is one of them. And suddenly, for a period of weeks and now many months, we stopped doing this thing that we had been doing for 40 years, if not forever.
Yeah, when that revision happened, which I also only know as a historian, I was not, I wasn't alive and I wasn't part of the Episcopal Church growing up anyway. But when that revision happened and there were these trial liturgies, some folks might remember these trial liturgies that were sent out and churches used them. And
I hear tell of zebra books.
Exactly. In fact, I have
the ancients will speak of zebra books.
I'm so tempted to run to my bookshelf because I have a zebra book right behind me, but I won't. At least I won't yet. So then the church sent out these questionnaires to people to describe their experiences at the trial liturgies, and the questionnaires now live at the archive of the Episcopal Church in Austin, and they're actually fascinating documents. I am going to go into just full-blown church history nerd mode now. They are fascinating documents because they reveal something that we don't talk about very often, which is people's sort of inward subjective experience of formal liturgical prayer. But many a questionnaire writer commented on the introduction of the passing of the peace, and some people really did not like it, really did not care for it, felt that it involved them too much with their neighbor. They didn't want to chat in the middle of church. So it was actually a fairly controversial introduction when it began.
And now, of course, it's the second coffee hour, the third sacrament, depending on your congregation. So it is interesting to look back, and I actually didn't realize that it didn't exist before until I'd been a rector for 5 years. We never had the passing of the peace lesson in seminary. They just assume you know how to do it. So I was a little bit shocked to learn that. I learned that questionnaire was kind of revolutionary in its own right, because that's not how prayer books had been assembled before. And was that not part of the rationale, because of the questionnaire responses that came back, part of the reason why we have a right one and a right two, to hold on to the more traditional language alongside?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but that sounds entirely plausible, that there was certainly there was a pastoral desire to allow people who wanted to use that traditional language to still use it. I think there were earlier moments pre-1960s, 1970s in the history of the Episcopal Church where really dramatic social change wound up changing sort of on the ground life in the church, not just liturgically, but in other areas. And I was thinking about, in the past couple weeks, I was thinking about the upheavals, the economic upheavals of both the 1890s and then of the Great Depression, and how much those economic upheavals actually wound up changing the Episcopal Church. And I've been thinking about that because, of course, part of what we're experiencing is, an epidemiological upheaval and a social upheaval, but we are also, I suspect, experiencing what will prove to be a long-lasting economic upheaval. Right. And so those two moments in American history, the 1890s, a huge moment of intense labor strikes that were sometimes broken by governors sending in strike breakers, famous strikes like the Pullman strike, a huge amount of labor unrest that was really, if you step back and look at American history, it was really the great crisis of American history between the Civil War and the Great Depression. And it prompted a lot of inner reflection in the Episcopal Church on how the social gospel should or should not take root in the church. That is, how ought Episcopalians think about bringing in the kingdom of God here and now, particularly with an eye toward poverty. And you see a real efflorescence of social outreach ministries. You see a change in parish life on the ground. So that if you look at Episcopal churches in, say, 1850, Episcopalians really had very little contact as churches, as communities, with the non-Episcopalians in the neighborhood of the church. But by 1900, that had changed very dramatically. And the posture of Episcopal churches to the needs of their neighborhoods, local Episcopal churches, and I'm sure the cathedral could tell stories about its own involvement. Churches began to sponsor really dozens, hundreds of charitable organizations. So you think about particularly the ways that women in parishes would get involved with sponsoring neighborhood daycare or kindergarten or food provision, food banks. None of that was happening in 1850. And the Episcopal Church was very involved with that by 1900, all really as a response to this sort of economic and social unrest of the 1890s. And it's hard to imagine our Episcopal churches without that today.
Right.
I mean, strip that away, and the Episcopal Church would look much different. So there's a way in which there was a lot of economic suffering in the 1890s, but that did call forth from the Episcopal Church something that now seems so vital to our ministry and to our sense of who we are as Christians and as Episcopalians. Mm-hmm. And then the Great Depression had a sort of similar or analogous effect. The Episcopal Church really changed its pattern of financial giving. Let me rephrase that. The Episcopal Church, I think, really rethought what we today would call its financial sustainability models through the Great Depression, there were no longer just a cadre of wealthy men who were able to keep the church afloat. And part of what you see...
I'm smiling because we're at the heart of the Gilded Age here. And that you just described some fabulous vestry meetings from 1910, I think.
Well, if we could go back in time, I actually myself would find those vestry meetings pretty interesting, I
know.
think.
Yeah.
But through the 1930s, sort of every member of the congregation got much more involved in trying to financially sustain the church. So you see this, again, this efflorescence of like, you know, ladies' ice cream socials where outrageously expensive ice cream was sold, but the ladies of the church produced the ice cream, and that money then went to support the keeping the lights on in the church. And really a whole different tradition of individual people getting involved with the mission of their church at the level of financial support. The system of envelopes, of having envelopes into which people might put cash to support the church. None of that was really in play prior to the Great Depression. So again, a real revolution in thinking about how am I as an individual person related to the church? How does my financial giving to the church sort of help me participate in the dream of the church? So obviously the Great Depression was a time of massive suffering and horror for many people. But out of that, in the Episcopal Church came what at its best was a real spiritual practice of people being more intimately connected to the financing of their churches. So there are these moments in church history, if you step back, not just looking at the last 50 years and not even just looking at the context of liturgical change, there are a lot of moments where larger social and economic and political upheaval in American society have actually led to internal changes in the church, things that might at first blush not seem overly connected. Mm-hmm. And I think there are two key moments of that in the last 120 years, both of which were actually connected to economic upheaval in larger American life. So one moment would be in the 1890s, where there was a time of real labor unrest, lots of very significant strikes all over the country, and a lot of real turmoil in American society over the role of labor, over how working class people were treated, over what legal protections working class people should have, how much money they should earn, of course. And really, if you look back at American history, in hindsight, that moment in the 1890s looks to be the most tumultuous moment in American history between the Civil War and the Great Depression. And you think, well, at first blush, what does that really have to do with the Episcopal Church? But it actually pressed the Episcopal Church to be much more concerned about the extent to which Episcopalians as churches cared for the social welfare of their neighbor. And if you look at sort of local Episcopal churches in, say, 1850, they really had very little to do with their non-Episcopalian neighbors. There weren't social outreach ministries, by and large, in, say, 1850 in Episcopal churches. And by 1900, that looks quite different. By 1900, throw a stone at an Episcopal cathedral or an Episcopal church, and it will have at least one ministry to care for the bodily well-being of people in the neighborhood. And that really came about through Episcopalians in the 1890s becoming sort of sensitized and made more aware of the needs of particularly the poor in their midst. And of course, a lot of what this involved was a change in the role of women. Women were not always, but very often, they were sort of the shock troops of launching a preschool or a kindergarten or a food bank or a way to provide health care to the poor in the neighborhood of the church. So that's a huge change for Episcopalians. Like, I think of our Episcopal churches now, And I think of the various social ministries that are just absolutely part and parcel of who we understand ourselves to be as Episcopalians. And I try to like imaginatively take that away from what it is to be an Episcopal church or a cathedral community. And it's like almost incomprehensible. But that very much became part of the Episcopal Church's DNA really through this larger social upheaval of the labor movement of the 1890s. Mm-hmm. I'll tell a little story, actually, if I might. And BJ, anytime I'm just going on too long, you should just interrupt me. But
wait, I will interrupt you. You're not going on too long, but I will say that as we look at the history of our own cathedral, which was the congregation is more than just over 200 years old, and very much it built at a time when we were at the heart of the Gilded Age. You know, I've talked in an early interview. This was Silicon Valley. It was in Northeast Ohio.
Yeah.
And this building was built, this structure was built around that very ideal, that mm-hmm. the first building that went up was a home for women in need. And there was always a sense of an architecture that isn't just a liturgical architecture, but one that's built around a civic, but also a caregiving presence. And that's really fascinating to think that was something that was actually about. So this is the plans for this building would have been going on at exactly the time that you're talking about.
That's so interesting. Well, I want us to like go into the parish archives and get more specifics.
Come on back. We're ready for it. Okay. I interrupted your story. Go on.
No. Well, this story is, I'm sure there is a story like this at Trinity, but I only know it as a New York story. So there was this church in New York, St. George's, where the priest was this kind of like, not a raging activist. He was sort of like a moderate social gospel activist, the social gospel being that movement in the church that really tried to help Christians think about bringing about the kingdom of God mm-hmm. For human beings on earth, including the poor, you know, even now, and not just anticipating, you know, the return of Jesus, etc. At any rate, the rector of St. George's preached sermons that were attractive to working class New Yorkers. And this was a fairly elite church. People like J. Pierpont Morgan went to this church. But because of this rector's preaching, more and more sort of working class men and women began to attend the church. And the minister, W.S. Rainsford, got himself into a little bit of a conflict with J. Pierpont Morgan. The rector, Father Rainsford, wanted the vestry to include at least one of these new members of the church who was drawn from the ranks of the working class and who had been attracted to the church through this kind of social action, social welfare word. And J.P. Morgan said that he was willing to go to church with the working classes, but that he didn't want a working class person on the vestry. He said, according to Rainsford's memoir, he said, quote, "I want the vestry to remain a body of gentlemen I can ask to meet me in my study," i.e. only the elites. And surprisingly, the priest won the day. Morgan, I believe, actually didn't leave the church, but resigned from the vestry. Mm-hmm. And a member of this new sort of working class community joined the vestry, which is kind of remarkable. I love that story. So I'm sure there is a cathedral story like unto it. But I won't put you on the spot. And
I think I have to spend a little bit more time in the stacks as well. But that kind of cultural study is a fascinating way to read the cathedral, and a way of also reading downtown Cleveland, how this city has changed and what that looks like. So yes, we'll spend a little bit of time in the stacks, and we'll come back with more questions.
There were also real changes in the Episcopal Church through the Great Depression, sort of a similar moment, obviously of enormous suffering and of real social and political transformation pressure. And and again, at first blush, you think, well, what does that have to do with being an Episcopalian? But one of the changes that the Great Depression helped bring about in the Episcopal Church was really a change in how local churches were financed. And so that by the end of the Great Depression, this tradition where a few wealthy families basically financed the local church, that tradition came under enormous pressure during the Great Depression, in part because many of those wealthy families very quickly lost their wealth or didn't have the excess capital to fund the church.
And once again, I'll add in the person who financed the cathedral was they lost their wealth within the next 15 years.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then what happened? What did the cathedral do?
Okay, again, I've got to put my crack research team on it.
All right.
Hang on, I got to call my kids. Wait a minute.
Probably the cathedral did what a lot of churches did when that happened. The cathedral was not alone in having, a key wealthy person or several wealthy people lose their money in the Depression. And so they got scrappy and they got inventive. And the ladies of the parish, were suddenly mounting ice cream socials where they charged a whole lot of money for the ice cream that they made. And that money sort of kept the parish afloat. But it also introduced a sense that really had been not strong in the Episcopal Church. I won't say it was completely absent, but it had really never been strong in the Episcopal Church. The sense that really every individual in that church needed to be financially connected to the church and needed to financially support even at a kind of widow's mite level. Right. So part of what you see through the Depression is this rise of smaller but more widespread financial giving. And you see things like the invention of the envelope system, where envelopes might be made available in the church for people to slip their dollar bill or their quarters in and give that money to the church. And I think this is a great change. I mean, obviously, it is wonderful when individuals and families of significant means are able to find something in the church that they want to give to. That's obviously terrific. But I think this sense that really it's actually part of our own spiritual lives, that each one of us is in my own life, I would say, spiritually transformed by the practice of even modest giving to the church. Right. So it was really like a new model of financial sustainability, if you will, coming into the church through the Great Depression. One that, I think a lot of us think now is the model of church financing that we've known for the last few decades. Is that going to be the model that carries us into the future? Maybe, maybe not. Right. I take some comfort in the fact that, if you look over the history of the Episcopal Church from the 18th century on, every few generations, there's major change in how giving happens and how financial support happens for the church. So I don't know if that's something that will partially come out of the COVID situation. I do think we are in a situation where economic pressure is being brought to bear on our institutions and our churches, and more economic pressure may actually be brought to bear in the coming year than even in this past year. So sometimes I feel really anxious about that, I will acknowledge, and sometimes I am able to feel just curious about it and to trust that there has been this reinvention of modes of support for the church over the years. And some of that reinvention has actually, I think, been to the spiritual good of everyone in the church community.
Well, if I think of not only my own relationship with giving and spirituality, there are a few core Christian practices that have been as transformative to me as giving in the way that you're talking about, which is it is first and foremost a spiritual discipline, and it's our role as clergy and as leaders in the church to teach that, because that's the greatest gift of giving is how it transforms your life. But to be the church where the John Pierpont, that Morgan guy.
Morgan.
We'll just call him Morgan.
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan, thank you. Sits on an equal footing with the tradesmen
Yeah.
both of whom are giving, well, I mean, proportionally, maybe the tradesman is giving a lot more if you want to really,
Maybe.
that's,
Yeah.
well, I mean, that's the whole point of the widow's mite, is that God knows what a denominator is.
Mm, mm, mm,
But to envision that, like, this is a church where we're all equal before God.
mm.
And that is I think that's a really positive way to see what came out of a very painful era, and one that has, I think it's one that, how many years hence now, 100 years, we're still struggling to grow into and understand,
Mm-hmm.
because money is always going to be something that's painful to look at. I also agree with you. I think this coming year is going to be a really challenging thing as we sort of see how things sift out and settle out. And you talked about upheaval, financial upheaval of the negative kind. But I think if we look at the mid 20th century and what happened in the post-war era, that was a whole different financial upheaval that shaped our churches in a whole different way. Look at how many churches were built in 1958. And that's partly because of a growth of wealth
Absolutely.
that also, and a growth of wealth and a baby boom and a high rates of marriage post-war that kind of warped how we understand who we are as a church and how we pay for it and how we live together. And I wonder how much of that, if we kind of look at bookends of a century, how much of that is going to get shaken loose in the coming few years.
BJ, when you imagine, project forward to the Sunday Forum 30 years hence, where we'll both be gone, but some pair of people are sitting around saying, well, this is the change that came for the Episcopal Church through the COVID pandemic. What do you imagine they'll say?
Gosh, I was going to ask you that, and you got there first. All right. Well, there's what I hope and what I imagine. I think, as you well know, we priests, we clergy, have been dealing with an upheaval over the last 20 years, where the generations, when we grew up, perhaps, knowing your history, you didn't grow up in an Episcopal church, nor did I.
Right.
But that day, so many years ago, when everybody who grew up in the Episcopal Church could say that the people next to them grew up in the Episcopal Church, those days are so long gone. And we're seeing so much has changed. And yes, the numbers, participation Sunday morning of churches across the country have been changing quite a bit. So we've known that something is in the air. And whether this, I think that what is probably shaken loose is a sense that we can coast on what we assume the church was a decade or a generation ago. I tend to think that I always like the word entrepreneurial, not because it's trendy. When I think of entrepreneurial, I can't say it.
But you like it.
We think sort of back to Silicon Valley. We think sort of who's come tech startups that dazzle. But I tend to think of my grandfather, who ran a 11-person feed and grain mill in Jersey City, New Jersey, and he got up every day at 4. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm starting to sound like a cliche. He got up at 4 a.m. and he drove through.
Lovely.
But you know what? He had to get there, and he had to, he built the business. And the people who worked for him were very much like a family. Some of them were family. And it was a matter of showing up, day in, day out. And I think that for me, the way I've seen churches that I've been a part of navigate tough times is really showing up. And getting in touch with the core pastoral and sacramental practices, and letting those assumptions kind of fall away, but working every day to build the church, and not assuming a single person is going to keep showing up just because you open the door and you're a church filled with nice people. That's So I guess my hope, could this be in 30 years, the moment where we said, you know what, this was when we realized we just couldn't assume that we could coast anymore, and we had to really hustle. But as I say that, I hope it's also a realization that, do we realize that it's not entirely on our shoulders? Because the temptation, again, as I use words like hustle, then that makes it about us and what we can draw out of the ground. Maybe this also confronts us with the limits of that, and realizing not only do we have to do what we can to build, but we also have to trust that God is here and that there are life cycles and there are death cycles in every church. And we're in the midst of, I tend to think, this is a great interview with me. I'm doing all the talking.
It is a great interview with you. Well, I will chime in with one little episode from a class that I just finished teaching at Duke. I taught a class this past semester, it just wrapped up, called Pandemic Christianity, where we were trying to look at the pandemic through the lens of Christian history and Christian theology, and then the reverse, sort of what do we see in Christian theology if we look through the lens of the pandemic. But near the end of the semester, I convened a panel of some Episcopal bishops and a sociologist of religion. And I asked them all, what changes do you see coming? And where do you see potentially the church being rejuvenated in certain ways through the pandemic, but also withering, right. Both and. And one of the bishops, in her answer to I took it as an answer to the withering part of the question. I'm now realizing maybe it was an answer to both. She said, and I heard her saying it with some concern, that she was concerned that at the end of the pandemic, which she said she expected to be another 9 months of really feeling like we're in pandemic land. Now, this was right before the vaccines were announced, so maybe it'll be shorter than 9 months, who knows? But she said she's worried about the sort of current cohort of leaders, and she certainly did not only mean clergy, she absolutely also meant lay leaders, our lay leaders in churches. And she was concerned, actually the phrase she used was ground down. She did not say burned out. She did not say tired. She said she's concerned about the way some leaders in the church are being ground down through the pandemic. And so I do feel a hope that everyone in the church will be attentive, I think particularly to lay people who are quietly going about the heroic tasks of keeping the church going in the midst of this stressful and confusing time. And what will it mean for our local churches to be attentive? That maybe some people will need to step away from that kind of work for a while. I don't raise this question to be pessimistic, but it seemed like a really concrete sort of snapshot of something that may be very much happening on the ground in our communities, about which I don't have a lot of wisdom other than wanting, in response to this bishop's word, to be attentive to that in my own place.
I think that grounding down is happening. And I also think that can be, there can be a refinement in that, again, going back to my own experience, when I was in seminary 15, however many years ago it was.
A few years ago.
A few, I think it was more than that actually. I don't think we couldn't have predicted what the next 20 years were going to be like, 15, 20 years. And it's in many ways been more exciting than we expected, and in some ways harder. And I think, though, that as we've gone through this, churches that go through a pandemic have now learned how to go through a pandemic and have learned a different way of caring for one another. That of course, it may not be as satisfying as what we're used to, but we come out of this with a lot of learning, but also a sense of what it means to navigate through loss, what it means, how do we get through loss without the things, the sacramental gatherings, the in-person, the touches, the hugs, the the in-person classes that make us who we are. And I don't think we're going to be like, well, we survived that, we don't need to have church again. I don't think that at all. But I do think there is going to be some kind of learning in this that's going to take a little while for it to come to the surface. When I went on sabbatical, I felt like I didn't learn things, but then 4 or 5 months afterwards, things started to bubble up where I just, oh, what, this is, maybe I need to go in that direction a little bit. And I don't want to minimize the great great loss that many of us are going through right now. But I'll be really curious to see what comes to the surface 6 months, a year, 18 months after things are quote unquote back to normal.
Well, and I will say that amen to the notion that we can't see this until later. I think that's exactly right. And I am noticing even this Advent, and again, not to just put a happy face on what's obviously for many people been a season of real loss, but I am feeling myself to be like available to Advent in a way that I'm not, I think, typically available, and specifically to the practice of lighting my own home Advent wreath, which I do with my church every night on Zoom for 5 minutes. Anyone from the church who wants to come, we do a daily Advent wreath lighting.
Beautiful.
It has been beautiful, and it's been beautiful because, this just sounds so hokey. I'm like embarrassed to even say it sounds so hokey, but just this exactly is a season where simply being attentive to flickers of light and to hopefulness, and it is just unavoidably clear that we live in a world that needs more of the light of God in it. And what I have not heard this Advent, which so many Advents we hear a lot of, is the trope of like, you're too busy to do, like, you're missing Advent because you're so busy. You're so busy getting ready for Christmas extravaganzas, or you're so busy at work, you're missing Advent. Like, no one thinks we're missing Advent this year.
Right.
Advent just is this year in a way that I feel grateful for. It feels like a syncing of the church time with where our social time is, in a way that I'm not always aware of that intersection happening.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking what that's making me think is that sense of attentiveness is what allows us to let discernment happen in the midst of grief and disruption. That doesn't mean that when we grieve someone that we've lost, we don't need to cover that up with smiles that we don't feel. But as I look, something about that leads me to think about my own life, and about moments where things have been particularly painful, or there's been grief or major changes that I didn't see coming. And one of the gifts of attention in the midst of that allows me, when I've gotten to the other side of it, to look and say, that was hell going through, and I would have never wanted to go through it. But then I came out on the other side, and there was something new that I knew, understood, or had, and I'm grateful for what I got out of that. That doesn't necessarily take the place of what I lost, but it does allow me to say that God has been there in the midst of those really challenging times, and to be attentive has helped me to, I'm so careful not to be like, to learn the lessons of it, because that's not where I want to go. But to maybe see, okay, the Great Depression was absolutely horrible. But there were ways that the church emerged out of that were transformative, and have actually helped us to be more faithful and more true to who we say we are.
Well, and I think part of what is feeling for me so apt about this Advent season is that Advent, maybe more than any other season in the church calendar, really does bring together lament and proclamation of hope. because the stance of waiting just is both of those stances. There is inherent in waiting lament, because that we're waiting means that something is wrong and needs to be mourned and lamented. But also that we are waiting means that there is a claim and a promise and an expectation of resurrection and transfiguration. And I just think those two are, the pairing of those two, of lament and hope, is perhaps overt in this moment in the church year in a way that it is not always so overt. And I've also just found myself thinking a lot about this, this basic Christian theological stance, which we in Latin call felix culpa, happy fall or happy fault, which is the language the church uses to speak about the fact that out of the fall, whatever one thinks about the narrative in Genesis 1-3 and the fall, that out of the fall and the damage that comes into the world comes ultimately a redemption that is even more perfect than God's original perfect creation. And that part of looking at the world as a Christian, it's not looking for silver linings. I don't actually think the silver lining is a particularly Christian thing. It's being on the lookout for good things that come out of horrible situations that could not have come about had not the horrible situation come about.
Right.
And I think those are all over this pandemic. And that doesn't mean that the horrors aren't horrible. It doesn't erase the horror. It doesn't minify the horror. It simply holds in a kind of glorious tension, but tense tension, the idea that there is something awful and there are some good things that simply could not have come about had that horrible thing not happened.
Right.
And there's a both and that I think Christianity is really committed to helping us hold that both and.
Right. I remain hopeful, even in the midst of really difficult times. Maybe that's partly because I am who I am and we are who we are, and that Christian hope is really something that guides my life. But it doesn't mean that I pretend that pain isn't pain. And there is something beautiful about great liturgy, meaningful prayer, that is able to honestly hold both of these together, both lament and hope. And I love what you say about Advent as the only way to really approach this moment as we look forward to incarnation is to really hold those two pieces together. And in a way, we can't survive right now. We can't survive if we don't hope. But if we survive without lamenting, then we're kind of fooling ourselves right now. Because we need, as human beings, we need that. As spirits, we need that. Well, thank you for being with us for our Advent retreat. Thank you for being with us for a rich conversation. Thank you for holding us in prayer. And when we can all travel again, we can't wait to have you back here.
I look forward to it.
Although, I mean, no myth or superstition, but was you traveling to Cleveland? Did that cause great unrest? I mean, we're superstitious about sports. Maybe we should be superstitious about pandemics. I have about 1,000 reasons for not believing that's true, so I wouldn't worry about that.
Great. I'm glad.
Lauren, thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you.
And for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us as well. Thanks to Lauren for leading our Advent retreat and for being with us this Sunday. Continue to care for one another, hold one another in your prayers as we move through a season of lament and hope.